This question has a good mix of familiar transition words, ones we should know very well, and ones that are a little stranger. The most obvious ones that we should be able to categorize using our dumb summary categories first is for instance, which is just in the for example category, and conversely, which is a fancy way of saying but, right? So the other two categories are and so. I don't see a so here. In other words, it's kind of its own thing, right? That just means literally what it says. We're going to say the same thing in other words, in different words. What's more, that's a little bit more unusual, but if I had to categorize it, right, I'm trying to fit it into those main categories, and, but, so, or for example. And not everything fits in there, so don't force stuff in, but I don't know, what's more sounds a lot like an and to me, right? We're kind of adding on something more, right? I mean, the most famous kind of, I don't know, and words are going to be things like furthermore, moreover, right? More, additionally, and additionally, right? Adding things on, adding more, right? So this just feels like it kind of fits very nicely in that category. Now, I'm probably not going to pick and because I know that is kind of my last resort, but I should look at these other things because they tend to have more powerful meanings. And so if I do need some sort of powerful transition, it would be one of these others. So let's take a look now at the sentences themselves. In this person's poem, Shorn Treaded Red, the poet contemplates a painting that has inspired her, Edel Adnan's 2020 work, Satellite 27. The painting, which features overlapping geometric shapes, fuels the poem's exploration of temporality and identity. In responding to Adnan's artwork, Wadud's poem reflects on the relationship between poetry and other art forms. Okay, well, let's start with some of the more obvious ones, right? Let's start with the but, right? Is this a but? The painting, which features overlapping geometric shapes, fuels the poem's exploration of temporality and identity. So they're exploring these things. So in responding to this other artwork, the poem reflects on the relationship between poetry and other art forms. That doesn't sound like a but, right? It sounds like, reflection, exploration. I don't know. That doesn't sound like a contrast to me, so that seems wrong. Now, is it a for example, right? I mean, the painting, which features overlapping geometric shapes, fuels the poem's exploration of temporality and identity. For example, in responding to Adnan's artwork, Wadud's poem reflects on the relationship between poetry and other art forms. I don't think it's an example because it's not an example of, I don't know, the exploration of temporality and identity. I'd want almost some sort of very specific thing, right? The painting is doing this, and then I want some very specific example of what the painting does. So like, for example, maybe one of the shapes and what it symbolizes, but I'm not getting that kind of specific here. So now, and also we've moved on to the poem, right? So that's again why the but doesn't work here too, is we're not contrasting the poem and the painting. We're kind of saying they're doing the same thing. So maybe it's in other words. Now, the one thing about in other words is that is the most common wrong answer for these. It can be right occasionally, but I would really need to be convinced to pick it. So is that last sentence saying the same thing as the other in other words? Well, this is talking about the painting, and then we're talking about now the poem. So how could we be saying the same thing twice if we are talking about different things? One is about the painting, one is about the poem. That doesn't seem right. Let me read it in there. Sometimes that can help. The painting, which features overlapping geometric shapes, fuels the poem's exploration of temporality and identity. In other words, in responding to Adnan's artwork, Wadud's poem reflects on the relationship between poetry and other art forms. This just feels like a separate point. And again, I didn't think that I'd be picking C at the beginning because I really do not like picking and words unless everything else is wrong, but I don't think anything else works here. I think we're kind of forced into it. Let's read it in there and kind of see. And let's read it in there as an and. Let's see how that fits. The painting, which features overlapping geometric shapes, fuels the poem's exploration of temporality and identity. And in response to Adnan's artwork, Wadud's poem reflects on the relationship between poetry and other art forms. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't sound great, but it also doesn't sound bad. It just sounds like we've moved on to another point, right? First, we're talking about the painting and what that does and how that kind of motivates the poem. And what's more, in responding to the, oh my God, I'm getting confused. In responding to the painting, the poem is reflecting on the relationship between poetry and other art forms. So I guess the point here that they're trying to make is that both of these pieces of art, the painting and the poem, are kind of reflecting on what art does. So it's kind of adding on another point. It's not an example. It is not a contrast. They're not saying they do different things. And it's not saying the same thing, because again, it's one sentence is about a painting, one sentence is about a poem. I really don't have a choice here. I have to pick C. I don't love it. So I would be a little nervous, maybe enough to be like, let me mark for review. If I do have more time left on whatever module this shows up in, I might come back and just like make sure I didn't miss something. But it's important to note, I would never change my answer unless I found something that I was missing before, right? I'm not going to change my answer just because I'm like nervous and I'm like, oh, I got to change something. I'm checking my work. It's got to be worthwhile. No, don't just change things randomly. If I look back and I saw some word or some idea that I didn't see before that would push me towards another choice, I would do it. But this is kind of the problem with these transitions when the right answer is and. You're picking it because there really isn't anything strongly pointing you in that direction. It's more that there's also nothing that points you in any other direction. So these are always going to feel a little iffy. You just have to get accustomed to that and be okay with it. But that's part of the process, is sometimes we're basically picking a transition that isn't really a transition and is not really interlocking ideas. It's kind of just saying, all right, well, what's more? Let's move on to the next one. So I hope that helps. It's okay to pick answers and be, confident in your process, even if you're not really getting a lot of evidence to support your thing. It might be because that's just where the process leads you naturally. That's kind of what's happening for me here. What do you think?